Hi everyone, welcome to The Tea with My Bookshelf. Today's guest is Amneh Shaikh-Farooqui, who is the owner of Polly and Other Stories. This store is so beautiful, vibrant and eclectic, and it carries a range of handicrafts made by local artisans, mostly women from rural and peri-urban areas. Amneh is also the author of Fearless, which pretty much describes most of the powerful, dynamic, intrepid Pakistani women in this book. So let's have some tea with the multifaceted Amneh Shaikh-Farooqui. Amneh, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
First things first, what do you think of my outfit?
I have to say, I must know where you bought it from. It's
Polly and
just
Other
gorgeous.
Stories.
No, you're perfect.
See how I plugged your store?
You're the perfect model, the perfect ambassador, as they say.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so what about your upbringing and early years kind of got you into sustainable fashion and local artisans?
So I think for me, one of the biggest triggers was that my mother is one of the pioneers of the micro-enterprise movement in Pakistan. And so when we were very young, we got to travel to parts of the country that many of us don't traditionally go to for tourist reasons or really wouldn't think of visiting.
Wow.
So, you know, she had 3 kids. She was a working mom, and we would be dragged everywhere. So my initial exposure to this wasn't really in some sort of structured manner. It was loose. It wasn't even meant to inspire me to do anything. But I went to a lot of small villages and small towns. And I think what I love about children today, children back then, is that we aren't as constrained by boundaries of language, of clothing, of material objects. So we would play with goats and chicken and just be just as happy as we would coming back to Karachi and playing in fancy doll houses, right? And I feel like those connections to our culture, our living culture, really played a big role later in my life because, again, my mother did a lot of work with craft communities and primarily from the entrepreneurship angle and micro-entrepreneurship angle. But that meant that I knew what these crafts meant to people who made them. I knew the people who made them very, very young. And I learned to value that labor and that beauty that they produce.
That's so inspiring. So the name Polly and Other Stories, what is the story behind that?
It is a mouthful.
Yeah.
I know. So the official version is that, we wanted a name that would speak to our culture. And initially we were playing with this idea of how the green parrot, Mittu, is such a quintessential part of Pakistani sort of folklore and poetry. And he's just an image that's there. But we also wanted something kind of international. So Polly is the global parrot. And also Polly is female. So Mittu is a very male bird. So I mean, all of this is really in our heads.
Okay.
The reality is that my co-founder and her sister founded a brand called Polly and Me, which was the first grassroots luxury handbags brand. And we wanted to take something from that and have it
an
as
extension
a part
of
our continuing journey. And the stories bit is because telling the stories, the narratives, and sharing the crafts, the processes, the voices of the makers was such an important part of what we were bringing to the business that we just thought this would be a fun name. At that time, I didn't know that H&M had a store called And Other Stories. So that was devastating to discover later.
You're like, but I came up with this
independently. But yeah, so that's kind of how we came up with the name.
Are you going to tell us the unofficial version, or is that off camera?
That's off camera.
Okay, all right. Okay, so I mean, your book, right? That is so cool.
Thank you.
And the name I think is so interesting, Fearless, because the word fear is always so synonymous with the lives of women in Pakistan and the stories that you hear from, every strata of women.
Absolutely.
So what is it about this book and about the name of the book that's so special to you?
So when I was brainstorming names, there were so many interesting options, but Fearless really spoke to me because I think fear is how we're controlled.
Yeah.
And I don't just mean women. I think it's how nations are controlled,
Yeah.
it's how communities are controlled. And historically, it's not just a Pakistani phenomenon, it's how you see global politics playing out today in so many different countries.
Definitely.
With the rise of right-wing nationalism, where does that come from? That comes from fear.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to talk about women. There's so many women in our history, in our culture, in our country from across Pakistan who were able to look at that arbitrary boundary and be like, it doesn't exist. It's like Sabine said, and which is written in the book as well, Sabine Mahmood, that fear is a line in your head, and you decide that you cross it.
Yeah.
And women that I wrote about have done incredible things.
They have.
Fearless things,
Yeah.
brave things.
Yeah.
So I just kind of wanted to make that the center of the narrative.
And so, speaking of fearless women and speaking of Sabine, I mean, just the safety aspect of these situations and these women, and if it was your sister or your daughter or, a loved one, like how do you draw the line between trying to keep them safe and yet like let them out into the world and do what they need to do and make a difference? I mean, that balance is so hard to straddle.
Absolutely, and as a parent, I think I realize it more than you do as a child, right? As a child, you're pushing and you're not understanding why. Why do I have to come home by a certain time? Yeah. Why can I not go to X place? Yeah. But when you look at the stories, you just have to open the newspaper and there's a hashtag some woman's name.
Literally. All the time, every day, multiple stories.
And that's where fear comes from. And it's really hard as a parent, as an adult, to kind of not police the younger girls in your lives. And as you said, sisters, daughters, wives. I think when it comes to, particularly within our patriarchal setup, where men do have a strong say in particularly women's movement. So I think even they need to not be afraid, because all of this comes from the desire to protect. Why would you need to protect something in that same way?
Exactly.
It's just, we just all have to be braver.
Yeah.
And again, one of the movements that I write about in the books is this fantastic one called Girls at Dhabas, where young feminists wanted to reclaim public space.
Yes.
And what I love about one of their initial kind of ideologies was this idea that we're taught that the streets are something to be feared.
Yeah.
But they're not.
No.
The streets are benign beings. They're just structures, they're infrastructure for everybody. And they talk about how when they were able to move past that dialogue, that narrative that you step out of the house and you're sitting at a dhaba in a public space, mingling across classes, because we're also taught as women in a certain spectrum of society to be afraid, particularly of men outside that strata. So there is a classist narrative there as well. Whereas, as we well know, really the men we need to fear, when we do need to fear them, are the men in our own homes, in our own communities, and in our own social circles. I think Noor Muqaddam's case exemplifies that for us today. So I feel like, fear and being afraid comes from lack of exposure, lack of information, lack of tools to adequately deal with problems when they occur, and finally, lack of open dialogue.
Oh my God,
as long as families continue to repress these conversations,
there's no conversation pertaining to these topics at all.
You have to live in darkness and fear.
And also kind of leading from what you just said, when we speak about fear, we're always kind of trying to shove the women indoors instead of trying to make the public spaces safe. Like, no one's talking about, let's make this area or this whatever township, let's make this a safe area. Let's, let the women go out there. Let's police it in the right way. Let the law enforcement do what they're supposed to do. We're always like, no, 12 o'clock, the girl should be home, or 9 o'clock, she needs to be home. Cover up, that conversation needs to change, and I don't see it changing,
It's a massive mindset issue, and it's a generational issue. I was talking yesterday to some friends about how, when you look at movements like Black Lives Matter, one of the biggest commentaries around that is around the social and psychological impacts of generational trauma.
Oh, for sure.
So women's bodies, women's minds carry that same generational trauma, which sometimes plays out in what is called called patriarchal bargaining, where, you know, women will put down other women because that's the bargain they need to make to survive. Or you call it, within the school girl setting, it's called relational aggression, where little girls will hurt each other in invisible and terribly painful ways and carry those scars for life. But all of this comes from absolutely the phenomenon you're talking about, that we prevent the girls from stepping out. We consider them the problem. That their bodies, their mere presence, their mere existence is the problem, rather than how society or the sort of broader environment is reacting.
And that is why, like, something like the Aurat March, like, my God, I mean, the reaction. And I'm like, it's just a bunch of women marching. Like, why is that such a big deal? But it kind of instills, like, the fear of God in, you know, society at large, which is just, I don't understand it. You know,
well, the powers that be never like any change. So when you're looking to ignite what people fear might be a massive social change. And again, this is not something new. It's across centuries, it's across boundaries, it's across cultures. Patriarchy is probably the last imperial force that we don't talk about in some ways. You know, we don't attack it the same way like we talk about everybody wants to talk about in scholarship about a post-colonial world, but what about a post-patriarchal world? How often do we have those dialogues?
Absolutely.
And also people, and I think this is an interesting point which has been raised by so many cleverer women than me, but this whole idea is that people fear the transition because they imagine that women will do the same in power that men did. So they're just afraid of a reversal of roles, and who'd want that, right?
Yeah, like we can see that happening with, like, the whole BLM movement, and now that it's, like, kind of reversing, it's not sitting very well with people.
No, it isn't.
Yeah, over here, I don't think anyone would tolerate that at all.
No, we can't talk, and we have our own version of colorism, severe.
For sure,
of course, which impacts.
And speaking of colorism and a kind of like a colonial hangover, your writing and your work, it really encourages kind of local culture, local traditions, and I think that's so important. So the younger generation, especially, you know, certain classes and certain stratas of society, how do you, as a parent and, you know, as you know, loved one, instill that sense of pride in your own culture without maybe, I don't know, taking it or kind of instilling religion into it? How do you love your own culture and take what's good from the West and yet be who you were meant to be, a Pakistani?
Yeah, so I think I was raised an expat child. And I feel like being third culture at in those very formative years was very helpful for me. So I've never seen culture and religion as intertwined. Because I lived in different places, and at different times I could see that different Muslims did things or looked different and ate differently and dressed differently, and that's culture. And so for me personally, that's never been a problem. It's something that I try and show to my children, because we're lucky enough to live in a country where there are so many diverse cultures, right? We're not a monolith by a stretch. And I encourage them to try and see the beauty of that and how that adds to the richness of what you can experience every day.
But do you think it also adds to the confusion a bit? Because we're kind of, we have Indian culture, we have Saudi culture, now we have Turkish culture. So it's like, okay, you know, so. I mean, I don't feel like it's confusing because I enjoy it. I enjoy it too.
I feel like that's what it's meant to be. Cultures, and also cultures are mutable. They keep changing, right? A culture, what is a culture in a particular space may not even be a culture in another space simultaneously. But also cultures change over time. Like what was Pakistan in the 1950s is not Pakistan today.
No.
Some of it for the worse, but you know, it's changing. So in terms of like the post-colonial hangover, I think why this is important to me is that, I mean, and research proves it, I don't even kind of have to give my own opinion on it, that young girls, particularly the research shows as young as 8 or 9, begin to imbibe very negative ideas about what they can achieve. And by the time they're 13 versus their male peers, they're already convinced that they cannot do it. So this idea of when you talk about Western, I mean, for me, the reason I wrote the book was that my daughter, she's a voracious reader, and thanks to so much of my work, she was very interested in the feminist space or the women's rights space. And she was reading these books, most notably among them is obviously Goodnight Stories for Rebel Girls, whose format inspired Fearless. But what saddened me was there was hardly any women of color, definitely like rare South Asian women, hardly any Muslim women, and no Pakistanis in the first version. And I was just horrified to think that these women were from another culture. So it teaches our young girls to believe that you need to be born somewhere else or be called Emily or Catherine to be able to, you need to look different, sound different, have a different life. When we're surrounded by examples of women from our own villages and cities and who sound like us, look like us. And you know, that adage, if you can't see it, you can't be it, does ring true. And I think that's kind of why it's very important to me that we look at these things, because I didn't necessarily have access, and I'm sure you didn't. We all grew up on the staple diet of Enid Blyton.
For sure. Pretty much all I read as a teenager.
And who did we want to be? What was that first female young person that we were inspired by? For me, it was George. I was really like, I want to be George, right?
Yeah.
And while that's fantastic, I feel like, why wasn't there somebody from my own country or my own language?
More representation, absolutely, yeah. Okay, and you know, the work you do, it kind of, you know, reduces the gender gap, it, you know, creates, you know, gainful employment. And how important is it for women to kind of, you know, just have that autonomy and that agency? So tell us a bit about what you are doing with these women and how it helps them in their families and their personal lives.
So I'm a big believer that economic empowerment or financial autonomy is usually the low-hanging fruits when it comes to the rights space.
Okay, yeah.
Can I say hyperinflation really helps my work, because I don't have to pitch as hard to the male members of a patriarchal setup that can no longer afford to feed their kids, that the women need to be allowed out of the home to work.
That's so interesting.
And I feel that that's an easy pitch, because you're not hitting on any of their deeply held normative views about manhood or womanhood. You're just saying you need money to survive, and I'm finding a way to honor your culture and share it with the world. And these women will still do this from home. It's an easy pitch. But what it results in over time is obviously when women start earning, they start interacting with markets, they become more educated about different aspects of mobility, of how the world works. They usually end up opening an account. They leave their homes, they network more. And over time, financial autonomy or economic sort of autonomy results in greater voice at the household level. When you're contributing financially, you get to have a say.
So you're saying that having financial autonomy in our culture specifically, it would lead to, like, you know, property rights, reproductive rights, you know, and everything else that one needs.
It's a fledgling first step.
Exactly,
Right? And I think, you know, for very selfish reasons, particularly in very closed off communities, male patriarchs can be convinced by the economic argument more easily than if you were to go in and say, I think all the girls in this village should go to school. Whereas if you tell them, you know, I think all the girls in this village should be able to earn something to sustain themselves. That's an easier argument to absorb where you have a lot of potential backlash.
Wow, it's great that you've kind of figured this out and use it.
It's been very helpful. Honestly, my own background in the social development sector allowed me to kind of go across villages and try and figure out why is it that friends of mine who work in reproductive health organizations, as you said, struggle so much, whereas we have an easier entry point. And I realized is because what I'm bringing to the table seems a lot less taboo, although it can be just as radical.
Got it. And most of these women are working from home?
Yes.
And that's a sustainable business structure?
It does become one.
That's
so
interesting.
En masse, it's very hard, and I think given the rising cost of transport, particularly for so many women to leave and to travel to cities, and where would they stay? What kind of accommodation options are there? How safe, as you pointed out earlier, is all of this for them, both while they're coming to the cities and interacting with market players, particularly where the market still remains a very male entity, which means that they both have to deal from backlash at home, as well as men in the market don't know how to interact with them or
Yeah.
to treat them with the level of respect and dignity they deserve. So within that framework, you have to find safe ways. So we work with leaders who are more mobile, more educated, and they can represent then groups of women. And in a way bring that product to market.
And the language barrier or the cultural barrier, that's not a problem?
I've never felt that to be an issue, and I find that really interesting. Perhaps it's a women's thing. I can't comment on how men do this. But I've worked in GB where, I'm working with a Brushiski speaking community.
Wow.
They don't know anything I know. I don't know anything they know. And I've never found that a barrier. Similarly, across Sindh, more recently, we've been working with Afghan refugees, and many of them don't speak. We did have some people who spoke Urdu and English, which was super helpful.
Yeah.
But at times, we were working directly with an artisan who doesn't speak a word of Urdu and English, particularly the older women. But I think craft has its own language. Yeah. It's such a
universal,
physical kind of medium, and it communicates color, technique. It's just, I don't know how to explain it, but it happens. You don't need words.
That's beautiful. So about Polly and Other Stories, I know you're a Karachiite.
Yes.
Why did you choose to open the store in Lahore?
So that's really easy. My co-founder was based in Lahore at the time when we opened.
Okay.
And she was very keen to bring something like that to Lahore because interestingly, Karachi has had its sort of niche craft stores for a while. Like growing up, we all saw Object, for example.
That was like the go-to
it was.
for gifts.
Lahore hasn't really had something like that. So you had the traditional sort of Afghan carpet style stores, but you didn't have this kind of gift store specifically for Pakistani crafts. So we thought, let's just go there, and it was a fabulous decision. We've had such a warm and lovely response, and work with so many people across Lahore now. So it's lovely.
And you have an announcement about Karachi?
We're opening up in Karachi very soon.
Finally!
I know. If you're following us on Instagram, then you're going to see sneak peeks.
Amazing.
But we're working on this and super excited
that is
finally
so exciting.
to bring it home.
Yes, so you can be like more involved. I love it.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. And congratulations.
Thank you.
Also, tell us about your involvement at the WOW Festival and, with the British Council.
Sure. I'd like to tell you a little bit about WOW first. So it's stands for the Women of the World, which is a global network of festivals. It was founded in 2010 in the UK by Jude Kelly, who was at that time the artistic director at the South Bank Centre in London.
Oh, wow.
Since then, it's become an independent foundation called WOW Foundation. There's been festivals across 6 continents and over 1 million people have attended them. Amazing. So WOW came to Pakistan via Karachi in 2016, and it was the first South Asian festival. And I got involved as a curator because I've always been interested both in arts, cultures, and rights. So it was like the perfect sort of space for me, and I love working with women. And it gives me this opportunity to work with an incredible cross-section of people from editors and writers to performers to legal rights activists. And it's just this amazing community.
You guys have such like an eclectic collection of women. It's beautiful.
So I've been involved since 2016, and of course the festival came to Pakistan and then eventually other countries in South Asia via the British Council, whose support helps bring WOW to Pakistan, obviously.
Great, excellent. So on that note, we're going to hit you with some rapid fire. Are you ready?
Yeah, let's go.
Okay. Okay, a book you keep going back to.
This is a really, really hard one. I don't know if there's one book, but I do love Margaret Atwood. I've loved her for many, many years.
That's E's favorite as well.
Oh, is it? Amazing. She's such an incredible woman. And can I tell you one thing about her instead of telling you about the book?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So in 2014, she wrote a chapter for an anthology which will be published in 2114. And guess why? Because 1,000 trees were planted specifically to create the paper which these books will be published on. And it's called the Future Project, Future Libraries Project.
She's a queen.
She's just incredible. The sort of stuff she writes, and it doesn't date. It doesn't age badly, which you can't always say for all forms of writing.
she's so ahead of her time in everything.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Karachi or Lahore?
sorry, Karachi
Yes,
for sure.
yes.
I was born and bred here.
Agreed. Favorite movie?
Also a hard one. So when we were younger and we had VCRs, obviously, there was this particular movie which starred Mickey Rooney. It was called Little Spies. I think I watched it 1,000 times.
No way.
I'm not even exaggerating. But I love that movie. It was about, rescuing dogs, and I've always loved animals. But there is one film that I would recommend to people if they haven't seen it. It's called Rabbit Proof Fence. It's a small Australian movie about the Aboriginal community, and it's just heartbreakingly beautifully shot.
Can kids watch it?
I would probably. It's just very. I feel like it's a very emotional experience.
Okay.
So maybe teenagers.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Great. Good to know. What is something new happening in your life right now?
Ooh, well, the store in Karachi for one.
Yes.
I'm also, we've just started curating for WOW in 2022, so that's happening.
That's going to be exciting.
It is exciting.
Is that going to be like a physical, are you guys going to go back to?
Digital again, because I think, just with not knowing how things are going, although things seem to be improving so much, thankfully. But also, where we draw large crowds, and it would be irresponsible to bring that many people in one space.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. On a scale of 1 to 10, how good are you at keeping secrets?
Fantastic. I'm an 11. I am an 11. It's
are you a vault, really?
I am a vault. Throw away the key.
Okay.
Yeah.
I believe you. Do you have any tattoos?
No.
Do you want one?
No. A, I'm terrified of needles.
Yeah, that's scary.
And B, I'm not sure I love anything enough to put it on myself for the rest of my life.
And what if you hate it later?
That's it. That's my big fear. It's like, what if I grow up?
Yeah.
And then I'm just
and
like...
And it ages badly.
That too?
Yeah.
So I have many fears around tattoos.
Okay. The next book you're working on, if you are?
Well, I'm always writing. I'm not necessarily sure it will turn into a book. I wrote Fearless for 2.5 years without thinking about whether it would become anything.
Okay.
But this is more long-form narrative, and I'm trying to write it from the perspective of young girls. So it's a group of young girls, and they're talking to each other, but it's like their inner voice. It's stuff that they would like to say to each other.
Okay, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. And how important is it for women to have good friends?
It's your lifeblood.
Isn't it?
It's oxygen.
I agree.
I don't think I could have done anything I've done in life without the support of women in the family. So like, my mother, my sister, then eventually when I got married, my sister-in-laws. But also I've just been really blessed. I still have the same friends that I've had since school, but I also make new women friends really easily. So I feel so privileged. It's this, people call it a tribe, but I feel like it's more like an army.
Yeah.
It's like, what tribe? This is full on an army. It's
I agree.
Amazing.
Totally. And my last question, you have these beautiful, luscious curls. How do you maintain it?
Well, apparently the secret, as somebody who spent a good 15 years of my life trying to destroy them, I chemically straightened them. I was so straight for so long that when I finally went curly, people thought I'd had a perm.
Oh my God.
So that's how long I fought my natural hair.
Okay.
Apparently it's just to leave them alone. That's the tip. Just stop messing with them.
Yeah.
So one of the reasons I think, I've really researched and looked into why so many women, particularly from our culture, spend so long in straightening their hair. Obviously, there's that Eurocentric sort of, a standard of beauty, and you receive so many compliments, like every time you blow dry it, so it incentivizes you to do it again and again and again. But also, and this really stayed with me when I was younger, I was reading, there's this study about how, how they talk about male politicians in the US and how they're more likely to get elected if they have a really full head of hair. I know Trump ruined that, but then Trump
ruined everything.
So, yes, he did. So he was a super exception to the rule.
Super anomaly,
But other than that, there was, and obviously these studies predate Trump, but around the time there was a similar study around, women in leadership roles. And apparently women are taken more seriously when they have straight hair.
How interesting.
And I read that study because I like to read very young, and it really changed how I felt because, growing up, again, we used to watch X-Files, and that Agent Scully, didn't have straight hair,
No.
but she was made to straighten it for that particular show because it made her look smarter.
Smart, yeah.
So it isn't even necessarily because we're running after some unattainable beauty standard.
Yeah.
It's because we want to be taken seriously.
Yeah.
And so for so long, I was like, if curly means, frivolous, and straight means serious.
Yeah.
And I chased that and I ruined my hair. But it's, it's
But
determined.
it's back now.
It's rebellious. It's the part of me I can't control.
Yeah.
So here it is. It teaches me to accept life as it is.
I love it. And on that positive note, thank you so much for coming and speaking with us.
Kamala.
And for those of you who haven't read this is amazing, and every woman specially needs to read this. Hope to see you guys next time on The Tea with My Bookshelf.